What does Trump's tone on China tell us about their economic future? When the US wants to tell the world what it's thinking, it doesn't always do it in speeches. Sometimes it does it in a document that most people will never read. Trump's administration just released a new National Security Strategy, the NSS, and the biggest story isn't what it says, but rather what it's not saying. For someone who closely follows the markets between China and the US, you probably also noticed this. Because the old language of stopping China at all costs, the kind of language that turns every disagreement into some national security emergency, is noticeably toned down in how it frames the relationship. So now, more economic and less ideological. So the question is simple. Is this the reset we've all been waiting for? Is it a short pause? And what does it mean for the future of the market? Speaking as a Malaysian living in China, no one wants a war between China and the US. Even if someone tells you they want it to secure the dominance through strength, they're not really thinking this through and what it means for the rest of the world. We're living in one of the luckiest windows of peace and prosperity in modern history, but the media survives by shocking you into the next crisis. That's exactly what they make money from. Fear sells, and they're told to sell as much as they can. So, to understand the change in tone, the NSS explicitly says, going forward, we will rebalance America's economic relationship with China. This is a very different tone from describing China as a civilizational threat that must be opposed everywhere. And the same document talks about pushing other major economies to adopt policies that help rebalance China's economy towards household consumption. That sentence is basically telling you, we see China as a rival, but we're going to treat this as an economic problem and not a political crusade. No regime change, no war. At least that's what we can hope for from the President of Peace. This softer position is happening just as the negotiations are happening before Trump's visit to China in April next year. I think Trump will be very welcome when he comes to China. Let's contrast this to Trump's visit to places like the UK, where he is openly mocked and protested. And that's just common sense. If you're trying to make a deal with your business partner, you don't just insult them in public every day, punch them in the face, and hope to make a deal in the end. That's political theater. You lower the temperature, not because you trust them, but because you want to build some leverage. Now we get to the difficult part to ignore, and the thing that's been in the news everywhere. America wants to compete with China, but right now, it's still exposed to rare earths. Think of rare earths like tiny magnets inside a phone. They're cheap, they're invisible, and without them, nothing works. These magnets go into electric motors, these motors go into cars, wind turbines, factory machines, and missile systems. You don't notice them when they're working. You only notice them when they're missing. That's the problem. China controls a large share of the supply and processing of these materials. So even if America has the best designs, the best engineers, the best factories, without those tiny little inputs, production stops. In this way, we can see the strategy as being very simple for Trump. Buy time. That means going along and making deals. If you look at Trump's actions, the patterns are clear. He's been trying to secure critical mineral access wherever he can. Securing a deal for the rare earth minerals under Ukraine's soil was one of them. That didn't work out. The war is still making that impossible, but the intent is what mattered. The logic is straightforward. If these minerals matter for the future, I want to lock it in early. And you can see how he's taking this same approach everywhere, from Africa, Australia, to Southeast Asia. The US is actively trying to line up alternate sources for the materials that China currently dominates. It's not about winning today, it's about building resilience over the next 5 years. A slow process, but we're starting to see that sign now. Imagine if you're running a factory and your competitor controls all the supplies of a key part. You don't just start a fight with them, you quietly find other suppliers. Only then do you negotiate from a position of strength. And that's what's happening here. The National Security Strategy, NSS, talks about building coalitions and improving joint positions, especially around these critical minerals in places like Africa. And in politics, you see the same thing. Coalitions are being formed to reduce their dependence on China's mineral ecosystem. You can't just rebuild supply chains overnight. This is something China has been doing for more than a decade. And until this rewiring is done, the tone has to stay a lot calmer. Now, the bigger shift. If you read the national security strategy carefully, the US is no longer trying to manage the entire world all at once. It's trying to really narrow its focus. The language pulls America towards a more regional, sphere based worldview. That basically is policymakers talking about hemispheric thinking. In practice, this basically means that the US will prioritize control and stability in their own neighborhood. Latin America, Canada and Mexico, even Europe. And they're starting to use this term non-hemispheric influences. That phrase matters, and I think we'll be seeing that show up in a lot of new articles from now on. It's not a moral language, it's not territorial language. But when the US officials talk about non-hemispheric influences, they're really just looking at China and their growing economic presence in places like Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina, in their ports, energy projects, and even their financing. This is not because what China is doing is illegal, but it's because they're doing it there. At the same time, notice what's missing. There's much less appetite in this document for projecting ideology deep inside Asia. More burden sharing for national security, more expectations that America's allies will carry the front line. We can see this from the way that Japan has been posturing against China and the largest arms sale to Taiwan for increasing their own military spending. The US is insisting other players play their part so that the US can step back from these global wars. Less insistence of being everywhere all at once. And this is where an implicit bargain starts to form. America will concentrate on its hemisphere. China will concentrate on its own region. Not because they trust each other, not because they agree on any values, but it's because they reduce the chances of a direct conflict. So, how does China see all this? Think tanks are suggesting that China is responding to this very well, specifically because it looks like it's turning away from this great power competition. And if the US moves away from ideology and into more practicality, that reduces the chances that China and the US will go into direct conflict. And things in the end will be safer for the rest of us. So, now let's look at the last piece of this puzzle. China has its own agenda. It needs to be more stable, improve living conditions for its people, and shift the spending of households away from property to goods and services. China intends to significantly raise household consumption as a share of GDP. Essentially, that means getting people to spend more money and save less. This is their plan for the next 5 years, but currently, China's consumption share significantly lags the rest of the developed world. Considering that they are the second largest economy, this is something they're working on actively. So, to hit their target, to raise the minimum level of spending by 2035 requires the country to grow at a 4% rate over the next 10 years. That's why trade stability really matters, because you can't rebalance towards this consumption if you're constantly worrying about a war that's about to break out. China is actively telling citizens that they will support them in their efforts to spend money. Even my barber is confident that this will happen next year. And we all trust our barbers, don't we? What does this mean for investors looking to invest in China or the US over the next few years? 8 years ago, the fear was existential. Sanctions, supply chain shocks. We didn't know when production or delivery was going to stop. Today, that tone is shifting from the commander-in-chief himself. This reduces the tail risk, the sudden shocks that turn the markets upside down, and it reframes the next 5 years. I believe we'll enter a time when the US plays nice with China for their own good, and China will reciprocate the favor for their own self-interest. A win-win. If you remember one thing from today, it's this. A calmer tone between the US and China doesn't mean this rivalry is over, but it does reduce the risk of sudden shocks while both sides continue to adjust. And as investors, it's all we need to know to be directionally correct. Anyway, that's how I see it from where I'm standing. Let me know what you're seeing from your side.